The Gremlins, a Royal Air Force story by Flight Lieutenant Roald Dahl. It was sometime during the Battle of Britain, when hurricanes and Spitfires were up from dawn to dark and the noise of the battle was heard all day in the sky, when the English countryside from Thanet to Severn was dotted with the wreckage of planes. It was in the early autumn, when the chestnuts were ripening and the apples were beginning to drop off the trees. It was then that the first Gremlins were seen by the Royal Air Force. A pilot called Gus, patrolling in his Hurricane at 18,000 feet over Dover, was chasing a Junkers 88 and squirting at it with his guns in short, sharp bursts. He could see a lot of little blue puffs trailing out astern. The German's rear gunner was returning his fire. He happened to glance to the starboard, and there, standing on his wing, he saw a little man, scarcely more than 6 inches high, with a large round face and a little pair of horns growing out of his head. On his legs were a pair of shiny black suction boots, which made it possible for him to remain standing on the wing at 300 miles an hour. And do you know what he was doing? He had a large drill, almost as big as himself, grasped firmly in both hands, and he was busily boring holes in the Hurricane's wing. Gus did a few flick rolls, hoping to dislodge him, but the suction boots held and the little man took no notice. He just went on boring, and with a look of purest concentration on his face. When he had done about 4 holes, he slung his drill over his shoulder, waddled up the wings, clambered onto the engine cowling, and bored a neat hole right through into the magneto. The engine coughed, it sputtered, then it stopped. Gus kept his head and put her down nice and easy on a straight strip of the Dover-London road, got out, and asked a policeman to get on the phone to his squadron and tell them where he was. A little later, his sergeant and fitter turned up in the squadron van and examined the machine. 4 bullet holes in your starboard wing, sir, the sergeant reported, and one's gone through your engine cowling and lodged in your magneto casing. Sergeant, those aren't bullet holes, replied Barry. A gremlin did that. And so, there on Dover-London Road, a new word was born. The word was spread to the RAF like prairie fire. It would travel over the seas and pilots in Malta, to the desert aerodromes of Libya and Egypt, and to the remote landing grounds of Palestine and Iraq. Some mentioned it in India, and someone else in Ceylon, and now they all had it. It was a very famous word. After his forced landing, Gus made his way back to the squadron and started to tell his story to the pilots in the mess at drinking time. Leaning up and against the mantelpiece with a mug of ale in his hand, he was holding forth to his 2 friends, Jamface and Stuffy. Then Stuffy spoke. "Gremlins?" he drawled, looking at Gus sideways. "Gremlins? Never heard of 'em." Just then there was a scuffle among the ashtrays on the table, and a little man ran over, leaned his shoulder hard against Stuffy's mug of beer, and began to push. Before Stuffy could reach it, the mug slid off the table onto the floor and smashed it into tiny pieces. The little man peered over the edge at the frothy pool which was spreading over the carpet, just to make sure that he had done his work properly. Then he stepped back and put his hands on his hips. Stuffy's jaw dropped. He looked at the gremlin, then he looked at Gus, and then he looked over at the gremlin again. The gremlin just stared at Stuffy, with a "so you've never heard of me" look on his wrinkled, rather vinegary brown face. He had a strawberry nose which looked like the moon through the telescope, and his head, while stubby, was as bald as could be. Obviously, he was a very old gremlin. He was wearing a little red bridge jacket with a pair of well-cut corduroy trousers to match, and on his head, tilted at as much of an angle as his horns would allow, was a green derby, and of course he had on his shiny black suction boots. Then he spoke, and his voice was surprisingly deep and hoarse. "Anyone else not heard of me?" he asked. He looked around the group of pilots, and with one accord they all leapt forward and seized their mugs of beer before they, too, should be pushed onto the floor. No one spoke. Thereupon the gremlin turned around, winked at Gus, and slid down the leg of the table onto the floor. He stumped across the floor, mumbled something about a date with a Fifinella, and disappeared. Stuffy was the first to recover his voice. "That, I suppose, was your gremlin." "Yes," said Gus. It was Gremlin Gus, and he went on leaning against the mantelpiece and smoking his pipe. "Friendly little type," said Jamface sarcastically. Gremlin Gus lost no time in reporting his experience to the other gremlins who were waiting in the hangars. "Well, the lid's off," he announced. "I've just introduced myself to a few of the boys, and we can work in the open from now on." It was 3 days after the first gremlin had appeared in the mess, and Gus and Stuffy were having breakfast after doing their own dawn standby. Suddenly Jamface bust into the room in a high state of excitement. "I've seen a Fifinella," he announced. "Don't be a nitwit," said Stuffy. But he was just about to say a lot more when there was a rustle of silk at the other end of the table. and something skipped nimbly across, dodging around the teapots, and stopped right in front of Stuffy. It was a Fiffinella. She stood there, hands on hips, enjoying their amazement. The pilots eyed her intently, from her small, elegant, curly horns down to her handsome white buckskin boots. She returned their stares. Then she looked straight at Stuffy and said, in a high, shrill little voice that tinkled the glass on the table, "Who's a nitwit?" Stuffy just sat and stared, so the Fiffinella gave Jamface an enormous wink, caught a swaying curtain, swung herself onto the window-sill, and was gone. Jamface looked at Stuffy and asked, in a very satisfied tone, "Now who's a nitwit?" Stuffy, who was a little angry, said, "You people seem to know so much. Perhaps you can tell me who these Gremlins are, and why they are here." Gus pushed back his chair, lit a cigarette, and began his story. "It was many, many years ago," he began. "More, almost, than you could count, when the earth was just beginning to stir in its sleep. England then was a country of dark forests and greasy swamps, and all the land was shrouded in thin white mists. All these forests and swamps were full of goblins and trolls and hobgoblins and pixies. They were everywhere except in one beautiful green wood, far up in the north. In this most beautiful green wood there lived a tribe of funny little people who were quite different from the rest. They had funny horns growing off of their funny heads and funny boots on their funny feet, and with these boots, and this was the funniest of all, they could walk upside down under the branches of the trees. Oh, it was a happy and peaceful life that these little men led, until the humans came. But they had no warning for the invasion, and one morning their world was suddenly filled with a tremendous rumbling that shook their little houses and even the big trees. The rumbling came from a lot of great trucks that drove up to the edge of the wood. From the trucks jumped hundreds of humans who marched in and, to the horror of the little people, started cutting down the trees. There was a great commotion among the tribes, and they prepared to leave their homes. The younger ones and their wives hurriedly packed up all their belongings, while the older ones stormed about, shaking their fists at the giants who were ruining their homes. But all the workmen heard was a rustling in the carpet of leaves on the forest floor. There was nothing for the little men to do but move very quickly out onto the hill nearby, where they had just watched the humans who were destroying their homes. They watched them chopping and sawing until the whole wood had been taken away, including the roots of the trees, which they dug up with picks and shovels. Then they brought huge rollers which rolled the ground hard and smooth, so that anyone seeing the place for the first time would never have believed that it had once been the most beautiful green wood. And as the days went by, the little people saw a huge factory rise on the spot where the wood had been. When at last the factory was finished and smoke came rolling onto the chimneys, they thought it was time to act. They sent out scouts who crept down to the factory and peered into the windows. At evening, they brought back their report. The factory was making planes. So that night the leader called a meeting after much discussion. A solemn agreement was reached. "We will follow those big tin birds wherever they go," vowed the leader, and he spoke for all of them, "to get revenge for the loss of our homes. We will make mischief for them, and we will harry and tease these men who fly them, until we obtain some satisfaction for all the harm that has been done to us." From that moment on, although for a time not a human suspected it, every plane that left the factory carried on board little stowaways. "I trust," concluded Gus, "that makes things clear for you two clots. Now pass me the bread, Stuffy, and shut up." As days went by, it became more and more obvious that the Gremlins had come to stay. When Gus made a forced landing in a plowed field at night after losing his way, the CEO hauled him into his office and began to let him have it. Gus stood stiffly at attention. "Well, you see, sir," he said, "I was milling around in the dark over the airdrome when a gremlin popped his head through the window and said, 'Good evening. Do you know where you are?' I said of course I knew where I was, and go away at once. Then he edged in a little further, sat on the side of the cockpit, and said, 'I suppose you're absolutely sure you know where you are?' I said, 'Will you go away, because I'm trying to concentrate?' Whereupon he climbed right into the cockpit and sat on the compass just in front of me, dangling his legs in the air. He was a night-flying gremlin and had a luminous face, which was a trifle disconcerting at the time. Then he said, confidentially, 'I don't think you've got the slightest idea where you are,' and I suddenly looked around and realized that I hadn't. Then there was Jamface's story of how he got a leak in the gas tank on the way back from Berlin. 'The nautic-minded gremlins got me,' he said. 'What do you mean, nautic-minded gremlins?' said Barry. 'Well,' said Jamface, 'they apparently came from the Coastal Command Station, where they'd been doing a lot of flying over the Navy. They became very nautic-conscious, and they all wore sailor suits with little yellow Mae West jackets over them. One of them got into my plane, but we didn't find him until we were halfway back to Berlin. Then Gremlin Jamface came along, tapped me on the shoulder, and reported the presence of a nautic-minded gremlin on board. "What's he doing?" I asked, and Gremlin Jamface replied, "He climbed down onto the gas tank, bored a hole in the top, and going in." I said, "Why he do that?" And Gremlin Jamface looked at me as though I were a complete nitwit and answered patiently, "To look for his boat, of course." As soon as the nautic-minded gremlin saw that there weren't any boats inside, he bored another hole in the bottom of the tank to get out again, and if I hadn't blocked it up myself, you wouldn't have had any gas left at all by now, and your engine would have stopped a long time ago, and we'd have been forced down and all made prisoners of war. "You see," said Jamface happily, "I've already started to get him working on the right lines. Gremlin Jamface is almost a very good gremlin." "How do you do it?" asked Gus. "Feed them used postage stamps," said Jamface. "Feed them what?" I said used postage stamps. It's the only thing they eat. Transatlantic special delivery airmail stamps are their greatest delicacy. "I don't believe it," said Gus, and went off to look for some used postage stamps which he could offer to Gremlin Gus the next time he saw him. But Gremlin Gus didn't seem to respond to the postage stamps treatment, and Gus himself became more and more worried. It came to a head one morning not long afterward, when Gus was dicing with a bunch of Messerschmitt 109s and Henkel 111s over the channel. He squirted one of the Henkels, which dived away, leaving a long plume of smoke in its wake. He was just about to have a go at another when he glanced in his mirror and saw a Messerschmitt on his tail, pouring incendiary bullets and cannon shell at him. He saw more than that. He saw smoke pouring out of his starboard wing, just where his gas tank was, and through the smoke he saw Gremlin Gus kneeling down and playing the white-hot flame of an enormous blowtorch through the hole in the smoldering wing of the tank itself. Just as the whole wing went up in flames, Gremlin Gus jumped aside, wriggled into the cockpit, and sat on Gus's knee. He was laughing so much that for a time he couldn't speak. "You'd better jump before you bump," he said at last. "You'd better jump before you bump." Gus had no choice. He opened the hood, undid the straps, turned the machine over, and fell out, and Gremlin Gus went with him, clinging jauntily to the harness of his parachute. Together they tumbled over and over in 100 mad somersaults until Gus pulled the ripcord, and the parachute billowed out and pulled them up with a jerk. As they floated down, Gus looked at the little man, who was sitting happily on the buckle of his parachute, busily polishing his blowtorch. "You little devil," he said, picking up the gremlin with 2 fingers and scolding him at arm's length. "I've got a mind to drop you. This is the second time you've ruined my airplane and nearly killed me. Why do you gremlins behave like this?" But Gremlin Gus just scowled. "Has anyone," asked Gus, "ever done anything to hurt you? I know I haven't." A large salty tear welled out of Gremlin Gus's eye and trickled down his cheek. "You men cut down the gremlin wood," he sniffled, "and gave the land to your giant tin bird." "Oh, so that's the trouble. Look here, these tin birds are planes, and they're helping us fight to save our homes. And your move, too. If you help us win this fight, we'll give you gremlins the deepest wood in England for your very own. Let's join forces and fight together. Isn't that fair enough?" But before Gremlin Gus could answer, they landed right in the English Channel, and after that it took all his strength to cling onto Gus's hair, while they bobbed up and down in the chilly water for 3 solid hours. All the time Gus was arguing and reasoning, and at last he won. Gremlin Gus sat still for a few moments. Then very slowly, taking a great risk of tumbling off and being drowned, he crawled forward. Leaning over Gus's forehead, he wiped the salt water out of his master's eyes with a tiny little handkerchief. 4 hours later they were picked up by an RAF rescue launch and landed at the little village on the Sussex coast. One evening, a few days later, the pilots were once more drinking ale in the mess, and the talk was all of gremlins and fiffinellas. Jamface burst into the room in a state of height excitement. "I've just found a nest of widgets," he said, and looked around in triumph. "Widgets?" said Stuffy. "Widgets? Never heard of 'em." But Jamface went on. "As I said, I've just found a nest of widgets located in the rear turret of my plane. There were 12 of them, very young ones." "What are widgets?" asked Gus. "It's very simple," said Jamface. "Widgets are the young of gremlins and fiffinellas. No one knows until they grow up whether they're going to turn into males or females, but it's usually males. In each nest of 12 widgets, only one will eventually turn into a fiffinella." But Stuffy wouldn't believe it. "All this talk of widgets is complete and utter nonsense, and what's more, Jamface—" But he was never allowed to finish the sentence. The whole room was suddenly filled with little squeaks and yells, as a whole army of little creatures hurled themselves at Stuffy in one solid mass. They climbed onto his shoulders and pulled his hair. They tweaked his nose, and they poked and tickled and scratched him until he dropped his cigarette. 2 got a hold of the cigarette, hoisted it onto their shoulders, and, taking a little run along the top of his shoe, drove the hot end like a battering ram into his ankle. Stuffy leaped up with a yell, and his mug of beer flew across the room and shattered on the floor. The Widgets, well satisfied with their work, peered up at Stuffy, but, crane as they might, they could not see above his ankles, for they were so small that they had to look 3 times before you were quite sure that they were there. Then the Widget leader spoke, and his voice was like a squeaking of a mouse. "What," he said, "is complete and utter nonsense." But Stuffy did not answer, so the Widgets turned around and marched out of the room in line astern. Then Stuffy told of how, when patrolling at 35,000 feet, he had flown through one of those enormous cumulus clouds and disturbed a swarm of spendules. There were shouts of derision when he had spoken, and Jamface said, "Stuffy, you're imagining things," but Stuffy was serious. "These spendules," he said, "are terrifying creatures. They're a breed of high-altitude gremlins, to be found only above 30,000 feet. They live in the rolling valleys of huge white cumulus clouds, and all day they eat hailstones. They're at least 3 times as big as ordinary gremlins, and their bodies are designed for high-altitude work. They're covered with long black hair to protect them against the terrific cold, and their faces look rather like oxygen masks, which probably helps them to breathe the thin air. Their bodies are flat and thin and therefore not affected by the pressure. The ones I saw," continued Stuffy, "had no legs, just short arms with suction gloves on their hands. With these, they attached themselves to my wings, looking like nothing so much as a lot of washing flapping on the line. They hung there and blew great puffs of cold air onto the leading edges, and the layers of ice began to form all over my plane. While they worked, they crunched hailstones, and the noise of their eating sounded like thunder. Naturally, I went into a spin and didn't come out for 20,000 feet, by which time the ice had melted away. The funny part about it was," concluded Stuffy, "that one of the old spandules got his hand caught in my starboard aileron and got carried down with me. As soon as we got below 30,000, he just melted away, and all that remained on the wing was a pair of suction gloves and a damp patch with a few black hairs sticking to it." It was 10 days later. Gus was at readiness. He had a temperature of 102. He had a head that felt like a kitchen range. Obviously he had the flu, but he was at war with the medicos and refused to report it. He was standing by his aircraft idly, watching another machine circling to the field to land. Just then, a head poked out of the window of the nearest hut, and a voice shouted, "Red 2 scramble! Scramble, Red 2, scramble! Get your orders in the air!" Gus was in the cockpit of his Hurricane like a flash. Parachute buckled, harness fastened, gas on, switches on, and away. Gremlin Gus, who had by now received a little training, and was well on his way to becoming a good gremlin, clambered up onto his master's shoulder and whispered, "You can't fly with flu. You can't fly with flu. Better not try. Better not try." But it was too late, and Gus had made up his mind anyway. Just how he got off the ground he never knew. The starboard wing dropped so suddenly and violently that it nearly went into the ground. Gus saw just what had happened. A whole group of gremlins, standing on the cockpit, had taken a running jump onto the wingtip just as the plane took off. "Control calling Red 2 aircraft 20,000 feet over Seven Oaks, steer 210 and climb to intercept, over." "Hello, Control. Red 2 answering. Message received and understood, over." And away he went. Gus climbed steadily to 20,000. He was frozen stiff, and little beads of cold sweat were starting out on his forehead and running down onto his oxygen mask. But Gremlin Gus was still sitting on his shoulder and whispering, "You can't fly with flu. You can't fly with flu. Be careful what you do. Be careful what you do." Gus felt like death. Gremlin Gus was so right. You can't fly when you are ill. His head was spinning. He searched the air with watery eyes. Then he saw it. First, just a glint of reflected sunshine caught his eye. Gradually, as he got a little closer, it grew into a tiny airplane. It was heading south and traveling very fast. Gus switched over his radio. "Red 2 calling Control. Tally ho, going into attack, over." "Hello, Red 2. Control calling. Message received. Good luck, over." He was catching up, but not fast enough. The Hun had seen him and was going flat out. Better pull the plug, Gus thought. That always helps. Yes, that did help for a moment. But Gus never had a chance. The German pilot, using one of the oldest tricks in the world, waited for him to come up close. Then, like lightning, he throttled back and at the same time applied just a little bit of flap. The Henkel seemed to stop dead in the air, and the Hurricane shot past before Gus could do anything about it. The German rear gunner was waiting for him. He raked the Hurricane from stem to stern as it passed, and Gus's right leg fell limply off the rudder bar. He had stopped 2 bullets, one through the kneecap and one in the ankle. It hurt like blazes and was bleeding fast. The hurricane was almost out of control because gremlins were out on the wings, boring holes, jerking at control cables, and hammering on the cockpit cover. There was a gang of at least 12 of them working on the port gas tank with drills. Everything was going wrong. Gus's head was spinning, and everything started to go hazy. How he found the landing field he never knew, nor did he know how the engine kept going, or how he managed to remain sufficiently conscious to regain control. What he did know was that he landed in the plowed field 100 yards short of his goal and turned over on his back. He saw the gremlins in their thousands lined up all along the edge of the landing field, and he saw them watching him and waiting their chance. He saw them, at the last moment, when it was too late to do anything about it, pick up the complete field and carry it away on their shoulders, running faster than the wind, because they were all athletic types. They wore little white running shorts with a blue stripe down one side. Instead of regulation suction boots, they had spiked patent leather running shoes. They ran for 100 yards and stopped, and the chief athletic gremlin said, "Mind your toes, down she goes. Mind your toes, down she goes. 1, 2, 3, down!" And they dropped it and ran away into a nearby wood. When Gus landed, the runway was still 100 yards away. Stuffy, watching from a distance, knew exactly what had happened. Gus languished in a hospital for many weeks. He lay in a small dark room with his right leg in a long splint. All the time Gremlin Gus sat on the bed rail above his head and kept watch. All the men from his squadron came to visit him, and the tales they had to tell about the work of the gremlins were harrowing indeed. At night the gremlins would move up the flare path over to an adjacent field. They pushed whole mountains up into the clouds. They altered the position of marker beacons at night and of familiar landmarks by day. Then Gus spoke up, slightly muffled by bandages. "Look here, fellows. You may think I've been wasting my time all these weeks in the hospital, but I haven't. I've given the gremlin problem a most serious thought, and I think I've found the answer. We've been neglecting our duty. Listen." And while the boys gathered round, Gus outlined in great detail his plans for the first gremlin training school. 3 days later, the GTS was operational and Jamface put up a large sign outside. Number 1 hangar, which read, "Gremlin Training School." The gremlins had to take 2 separate courses of training. In the right-hand corner of the hangar, there was a large sign which said, "Initial Training School," and in the left-hand corner was another equally large one which said, "Advanced Training School." Gremlin Gus was brought from the hospital and put in sole charge of Initial Training School. He worked from morning till night, trotting around and around, supervising and helping and scolding and encouraging. The first thing the gremlins saw when they entered the school was a rather ancient plane, and on its fuselage were painted in large red letters the words, "Do not touch." With a whoop, they all ran forward, clambered onto the machine, and immediately set to work boring holes in the wings, messing about with the engine, and doing all those things which cause pilots so much trouble. But they got a rude shock. Just as the gremlin started boring a hole into the fuselage, a stream of old engine oil would shoot out and hit him in the face. Each wire a gremlin touched would carry enough current to give him a nasty shock, and if one started jumping about on the wings, he shot through a secret trap door into a bucket of green paint cleverly placed just below. This ruined his clothes, and gremlins are particularly sensitive about their dress. He was usually so infuriated and humiliated that he resolved there and then never to jump up and down on the wings anymore. The process of training in ITS went on this way, until finally the gremlins were cured of all their misdeeds. This was all very well, so far as it went, but of course it was not enough. The gremlins had now been taught not to be bad anymore, but they hadn't been taught to be good. For the time being they became negative gremlins. But they were now ready for the advanced training school, where Gremlin Jamface was in charge. At ATS there was another old plane, but this one was very broken down. Everything was either bent or cracked or torn, and there was ice on the wings and mist on the windshield. Gremlin Jamface went around with a satchel of used postage stamps slung over his shoulder, encouraging all the gremlins to go and repair the machines. Delighted with the prospect of getting some of their favorite food, they set to work immediately. They wiped the windshields and de-iced the wings. They straightened the propeller blades. They mended the punctures and sewed up tears. They stopped the leaks and blocked up the holes, and each time they did a little job, Gremlin Jamface came around and gave them a used postage stamp. Every now and then, when he thought no one was looking, he would pop one into his own mouth. He did this a great many times during the course of the day, with the results that he always had indigestion. After working hard for a time in ATS, the gremlins began to find it was rather nice always to be doing good and useful things, and in the end they were glad to work just for the fun of it. They were good gremlins. And so the Gremlin Training School continued to flourish, and in a very short time the news of its success spread to other RAF stations where gremlin trouble was being experienced. to bomber squadrons in the south, to fighter squadrons guarding the towns in the Midlands, to the squadrons of the Coastal Command on remote islands off North Scotland. They rounded up all their bad gremlins and put them in little wooden boxes with holes on top, and sent them down to Gremlin Training School in care of their squadron intelligence officer. The school grew bigger and bigger and more famous. Just after Christmas, Gus came out of the hospital and returned to his squadron. But it was not the same Gus as before. He walked with a slight limp, and the medicos had dashed his fondest hope of saying that he would never be able to fly again. To a pilot, being alive but earthbound is worse than not being alive at all. The weeks went by, and before anyone knew it, spring had come. But spring brought no hope to poor Gus. 3 times he failed to pass his medical exam. The news traveled over aerodrome to the Gremlins, who were very sorry for Gus, and they all scratched their bald little heads, wondering how they could help. Gremlin Gus himself was summoned to a conference of the tribe, but all sorts of ideas and suggestions were put forward. But none of them were any good, and the meeting was just about to break up when a little man in the back row, who was called Gremlin Griff, stood up and asked, "Why don't we tell him to ask for another medical exam? Then we could all go along and help him to get through." Gremlin Gus jumped up and clapped his hands and said that was a wonderful idea, and ran away as fast as his little legs would carry him to tell his master. Gus was delighted, and rushed off to the medico, and told him he was suddenly feeling very much better, and could he please have another medical exam. "You only had your last one the other day," said the medico. But Gus said that it didn't matter. He said that all of a sudden he had begun to feel so much better that he was quite sure that he'd made an amazing recovery. So the medico, who understood pilots very well, said, "All right, come along at 10:30 next Tuesday morning." He knew he wouldn't get any peace otherwise. So everything was arranged. All that day and far into the night, a stream of little couriers, who were reformed athletic gremlins, using their strength and endurance for good purpose, flowed out of the aerodrome, bearing the news to the good gremlins in every other squadron in the country. They each carried with them a little note, which read, "Operational order. All those that can be spared report to the hospital before 10:30 hours next Tuesday to help a friend in trouble. Signed, Gremlin Gus." Each one stopped only once on the journey, and then just long enough for himself to munch on a used postage stamp. Each arrived at his destination and delivered his message before the sun rose the next morning, and each turned home before the sun set in the evening, bearing a reply which promised assistance. The day fixed for Gus's medical dawned bright and clear. The gremlins were assembling in the hospital, but of course no one could see them. Gremlins, Fifinellas, and Widgets crowded around the examination room in their hundreds. They perched on the pictures and ranged themselves along the bookshelves. They hung from the lamps and crowded the table. Still more squatted on the floor cross-legged in neat little rows. Naturally, the medico didn't see them. Only pilots and navigators and air gunners and people who can fly can see those things. Then the examination began, and the medico said, "Jump up and down on that chair 10 times, and then let me feel your pulse." Gus was jumping up and down, and then gave the medico his wrist. He knew his pulse was going too fast, and he could hear his heart beating great hammer blows in his chest. But immediately a gremlin hurried forward, gently lifted the medico's finger off the wrist, and tapped it with a little mallet, at first a bit faster than normal, then quickly slowing down to a steady 72 to the minute. "Very good," said the medico, and noted it down on a sheet of paper. "And now you will take off your shirt." And all the Fifinellas turned around, covering their eyes with their hands. The gremlins watched intently as the medico tested Gus's heart and thumped his back. Whenever there was any sign of trouble, one or two would run forward and put matters right. When the medico tapped Gus's knee to make his leg jump, as they always do on these occasions, 6 gremlins got behind his foot and gave a little push at the right moment. "Very good," said the medico. "You can dress again now." And all the Fifinellas uncovered their eyes and turned around once more. Then, after a lot more tapping and thumping, came the big test, the one Gus had failed so far every time. It consisted of standing on one leg with your eyes shut and balancing there for a period without falling over. Gus was all right on his left leg, but the right one, with a couple of bullet wounds in it, was not what it had once been. "Shut your eyes tight and balance on your right leg and stay there until I tell you to stop," said the medico. This was the moment that poor Gus had been dreading. Immediately, every gremlin and every Fifinella rushed to his assistance. They stood on each other's shoulders and held up his left foot. They formed a solid wall around his right leg and braced it from all sides. They attached little ropes to his shoulders and pinned him down to the ground, making him rigid and steady like a tent pole. 2 Widgets climbed up and held his eyelids down tight so no one could say he was cheating, and Gus balanced steady as a rock on his wounded right leg. It seemed ages before Gus heard the medico say, "Remarkable, you certainly made an amazing recovery," and he noted all the things down on his sheet of paper. He then looked up and smiled. "I think you are quite fit to fly at last, and good luck to you." Gus could hardly believe his ears. He danced out of the room and down the passage, setting a straight course for the squadron mess, with all the Gremlins, Fiffinellas, and Widgets following in a long line behind. They chanted a special song, which no one has ever heard except pilots and navigators, and air gunners and those who fly. It has a great number of verses, and as they sing, the Gremlins hop from one leg to another in time with the rhyme. Whipple scrumpet in the sky, whipple scrumpet in the sky, pilots all were born to fly, higher than the highest high, whipple scrumpet in the sky. The Gremlins danced far into the night and feasted upon used postage stamps until the small hours, and above the sounds of their revelry was heard the voice of Gus as he sang many songs and toasted his small benefactors with many tankards of good strong ale. And so, with the help of the Gremlins, and because he had great faith and determination, a pilot was able to return to his flying. But he was only one of many hundreds who since then have come to know and understand the truth of these little people, who have learned to love them, to fear them, and to respect them. He is, indeed, an unhappy man who goes up into the sky to fight, saying, "I do not believe in gremlins."